Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen stared at the wall of photographs in the Pentagon corridor. Rows of decorated officers looked back at her, their chests heavy with medals, their eyes holding the weight of battles fought and won. Combat infantry badges gleamed like golden shields. Purple hearts told stories of blood and sacrifice. Bronze stars whispered of courage under fire. Sarah's reflection caught in the glass frame. Her own uniform was pristine, pressed to perfection, but her chest told a different story. No combat action badge adorned her jacket. No deployment patches marked her sleeves. At 32, she was one of the Navy's brightest intelligence analysts. But to many in the halls of the Pentagon, she was nothing more than a desk officer who had never heard a shot fired in anger. Well, if it isn't our favorite paper pusher. Sarah turned to see Commander Jake Morrison approaching, his combat boots echoing against the marble floor. Behind him walked two other officers, both sporting the badges and patches that marked them as warriors. Morrison's chest was a constellation of decorations from 3 deployments to Afghanistan and 2 to Iraq. His eyes held that particular hardness that came from seeing too much death. "Commander Morrison," Sarah nodded professionally, keeping her voice steady despite the knot forming in her stomach. "Heard you're briefing the Admiral tomorrow about some intelligence assessment," Morrison said, his voice dripping with barely concealed contempt. "Must be nice. Getting FaceTime with brass without ever having to dodge a bullet." The 2 officers behind him chuckled. Captain Rodriguez, whose arm bore the scars of an IED blast in Kandahar, shook his head. "I still don't get why they're putting analysts in positions that should go to real soldiers. Because someone has to interpret all that fancy computer data, while the rest of us do the actual fighting," Morrison replied, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "Isn't that right, Chen? Safe and sound behind your monitors while Marines are bleeding out in desert sand." Sarah felt the familiar burn of injustice rise in her chest, but she kept her expression neutral. She had learned long ago that showing emotion in these moments only fed their perception of her as weak. "If you'll excuse me, gentlemen, I have work to do." "Work?" Morrison laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the walls. "You call sitting in an air-conditioned office looking at satellite photos work? Try clearing a building full of insurgents. Try carrying a wounded teammate to a helicopter under fire. That's work." Sarah walked away, their laughter following her down the corridor like a pack of hunting dogs. She had heard it all before. The whispers in the hallways. The jokes about PowerPoint warriors and laptop commandos. The subtle exclusions from conversations when real officers gathered to share war stories. But what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Sarah Chen had prevented more American deaths from behind her computer screen than most of them had, saved on the battlefield. 3 years earlier, her analysis of communication patterns had exposed a network of double agents in Pakistan, saving an entire Special Forces unit from walking into an ambush. 2 years ago, her work tracking financial transactions had led to the capture of a bomb maker responsible for dozens of attacks on NATO forces. 6 months ago, her identification of a new recruitment pattern had disrupted 3 separate terrorist cells before they could launch attacks on American soil. But none of that mattered in a culture that measured worth by the weight of combat. Decorations. Sarah reached her office on the 3rd floor, a cramped space she shared with 2 other analysts. The walls were covered with monitors displaying real-time intelligence feeds from around the world. Satellite images, intercepted communications, financial data, social media analysis. The digital nervous system of America's intelligence apparatus. She sat down at her workstation and pulled up the briefing she would deliver to Admiral Harrison the next morning. For 3 weeks, she'd been tracking something that made her blood run cold, a pattern hidden in the noise of global communications. Fragments of conversations in multiple languages, financial transfers that seemed random but followed a subtle mathematical progression, social media posts that appeared innocent but contained coded messages. Taken individually, each piece meant nothing, but Sarah saw the connections others missed. She saw the picture forming in the digital shadows, and what she saw terrified her. Someone was planning something massive, something that would make September 11th look like a minor incident. The attack was coming soon, within weeks, possibly days, and the target was American soil. But convincing anyone to listen would be nearly impossible. She had no combat experience to lend weight to her words, no deployment stories to build credibility, no scars to prove she understood the cost of failure. "Working late again, Chen?" Sarah looked up to see Lieutenant Jessica Park entering the office. Park was one of the few people in the building who treated Sarah with genuine respect. A former Air Force pilot who had transitioned to intelligence work after an injury ended her flying career. Park understood what it meant to be dismissed by the combat brotherhood. Always, Sarah replied with a tired smile. You? Same old. Park settled into her chair. Heard Morrison giving you grief again in the hallway. Word travels fast, his voice travels fast. He wasn't exactly being subtle. Park's expression darkened. I swear sometimes I think these guys would rather lose a war than admit a non-combatant might have something valuable to contribute. Sarah turned back to her screen. Maybe they're right. Maybe experience matters more than analysis. That's bullshit and you know it. Park rolled her chair closer. You've saved more lives with your brain than most of them have with their guns. The problem isn't your qualifications, it's their prejudice. But even Park didn't know the full scope of what Sarah was working on. The classification level was so high that Sarah couldn't share details with anyone below Admiral Harrison's level. She was carrying the weight of a potential catastrophe alone, with no one to validate her fears or confirm her analysis. Her computer chimed with an incoming secure message. Sarah's heart skipped as she read the sender, Admiral Harrison's office. Lieutenant Commander Chen, the message read, your briefing tomorrow has been moved up. Report to Conference Room Alpha at 0800. Be prepared to present your findings to a Joint Intelligence Review Board. Sarah's hands began to tremble slightly. A Joint Review Board meant representatives from all branches of military intelligence, plus civilian agencies. It meant skeptical faces and hostile questions. It meant having to defend her analysis to people who would look at her chest, see no combat badge, and immediately discount everything she said. But it also meant a chance to warn the right people about what was coming. Bad news? Park asked, noticing Sarah's expression. I don't know yet, Sarah replied, staring at the screen, but I'm about to find out if 3 years of MIT computer science and a master's in international relations can compete with a chest full of combat medals. Outside the windows, Washington, D.C. sprawled beneath a gray October sky. Somewhere in that maze of streets and monuments, Sarah knew the enemy was moving, planning, preparing to strike at the heart of American power, and tomorrow morning, she would have to convince a room full of warriors that a woman with no combat badge might be the only thing standing between America and its darkest hour. The clock on her wall ticked toward midnight as Sarah began preparing for the fight of her L. Sarah arrived at the Pentagon at 0530, 3 hours before her briefing. The corridors were empty except for security guards and the occasional early arriving officer. She needed the quiet to rehearse her presentation one final time, to anticipate every possible objection and prepare her responses. But as she walked toward Conference Room Alpha to test her equipment, voices echoed from inside. Sarah paused at the door, recognizing the unmistakable tone of Commander Morrison. Complete waste of time, he was saying. Harrison's lost his mind if he thinks some desk jockey is going to tell us something we don't already know about terrorist threats. Maybe she's found something real, came another voice Sarah didn't recognize. The Admiral wouldn't call a joint board meeting for nothing. Morrison's laugh was bitter. Trust me, I've seen her type before. All theories and computer models, no real-world experience. She probably thinks she's discovered the next 9/11 because she found some suspicious Google searches. Sarah's hands clenched into fists. She wanted to burst through that door and show them exactly what she had found. But she forced herself to turn away and find another room to prepare. Their skepticism would only make her eventual vindication more satisfying. In a small briefing room 2 floors up, Sarah connected her laptop to the projection system and began running through her presentation. Slide after slide of data flowed across the screen: communication intercepts, financial transaction patterns, social media analysis, satellite imagery. To an untrained eye, it looked like random noise. But Sarah saw the symphony hidden in the chaos. The pattern had first emerged 6 weeks ago during routine monitoring of suspected terrorist communications. A single Arabic phrase had appeared in 3 different intercepted phone calls across 2 continents. The garden needs watering. Individually, the phrase meant nothing. But Sarah had flagged it for further analysis. Within days, similar agricultural metaphors began appearing in communications between known terrorist sympathizers. The seeds are planted. The harvest approaches. The fruit is ready to pick. Always spoken by different people, in different countries using different communication methods. Then came the financial data. Sarah had written algorithms to track suspicious money transfers, looking for patterns that indicated terrorist funding. What she found was unprecedented. A web of transactions so sophisticated it had taken her 3 weeks to map even a fraction of it. Millions of dollars flowing through a maze of shell companies, cryptocurrency exchanges, and charitable organizations. The money originated from sources in 12 different countries and ultimately converged into accounts controlled by 7 individuals. 7 people Sarah had never heard of, who didn't appear on any terrorist watch lists, who had no obvious connections to known extremist groups. But when she dug deeper, she found the connections. All 7 had attended the same engineering conference in Dubai 2 years earlier. All 7 had purchased plane tickets to the United States within the past month. And all 7 were currently somewhere inside American borders. The social media analysis was even more chilling. Sarah had developed software to identify coded messages hidden in apparently innocent posts. Environmental activists posting about clearing invasive species from native habitats. Urban planning enthusiasts discussing controlled demolitions for urban renewal. Chemistry students sharing exciting experiments with reactive compounds. Each message, by itself, was perfectly normal. Together, they formed a communication network coordinating something massive. Lieutenant Commander Chen. Sarah spun around to find Admiral Harrison standing in the doorway. James Harrison was a bear of a man, 6 feet 4 inches of solid muscle despite his 58 years. His gray hair was perfectly trimmed, his uniform immaculate. 3 decades of naval service had carved lines of authority into his face, but his eyes held the sharp intelligence that had made him one of the Navy's youngest flag officers. Admiral, Sarah snapped to attention. At ease. Harrison stepped into the room, studying the data projected on the wall. I wanted to speak with you before the briefing. There are going to be some skeptical people in that room. I understand, sir. Harrison's eyes fixed on her chest, noting the absence of combat decorations. Some of them are going to question whether you have the experience to make assessments about terrorist threats. They're going to wonder if you truly understand the consequences of being wrong. Sarah felt a flush of anger but kept her voice steady. With respect, Admiral, I may not have combat experience, but I understand the mathematics of death. Every pattern I've identified, every algorithm I've written, has been designed to save American lives. I know your record, Chen. The Pakistan network, the bomb maker in Syria, the cells you disrupted in Germany. Harrison's expression softened slightly. But the people in that room don't know about those operations. They're classified above their clearance level. Then what am I supposed to tell them? How do I convince them to listen? You tell them the truth. You show them the data, and you trust that the evidence will speak for itself. Harrison paused at the door. But Chen, if you're wrong about this, if you're seeing patterns that aren't there, you'll be finished in this town. No one will ever take you seriously again. After Harrison left, Sarah stared at her reflection in the blank monitor screen. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her like a physical force. She was asking the military establishment to take action based on her analysis alone, asking them to potentially deploy resources, change security protocols, disrupt operations, all on the word of someone they saw as an inexperienced analyst. But the data didn't lie. The pattern was real, and every hour they delayed increased the chance that her worst fears would come true. At 07:45, Sarah made her way to Conference Room Alpha. The room was already filled with military brass and intelligence officials. She recognized faces from briefings and news reports, generals who had commanded divisions in Iraq, admirals who had overseen naval operations in the Pacific, CIA section chiefs who had spent careers tracking terrorist networks, and there, in the front row, sat Commander Morrison. His expression was a mixture of amusement and anticipation, like a cat watching a mouse walk into a trap. Ladies and gentlemen, Admiral Harrison called the room to order. We're here to receive a threat assessment from Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, Commander. Chen specializes in pattern analysis and has identified what she believes to be an imminent terrorist threat to the homeland. Sarah noticed the subtle emphasis Harrison placed on her lack of combat experience, specializes in pattern analysis, rather than counter-terrorism operations. Even her supporter was hedging his bets. She walked to the front of the room, connected her laptop, and faced the assembled group. 37 of the most experienced military and intelligence professionals in the country stared back at her. Most of their expressions ranged from skeptical to openly dismissive. 3 weeks ago, Sarah began, I identified a communication pattern that suggests a coordinated terrorist attack is being planned against targets inside the United States. The sophistication of this operation exceeds anything we've seen since 9/11. Morrison's hand shot up immediately. Commander Chen, what's your assessment based on? Combat intelligence? Field reports from assets in theater? Computer analysis of intercepted communications, financial transactions, and social media activity? Sarah replied. A murmur rippled through the room. Sarah heard fragments of whispered conversations. Computer analysis. No human sources. Desk analyst, General Patricia Williams, a stern woman whose chest bore decorations from 2 wars, leaned forward. Commander, do you have any field experience with terrorist operations? Have you ever been deployed to a combat zone? No, ma'am. My expertise is in data analysis and pattern recognition. The murmur grew louder. Sarah saw heads shaking, eyes rolling. She was losing them before she'd even presented her evidence. If I may continue, Sarah said, raising her voice slightly. The pattern I've identified indicates 7 foreign nationals, currently in the United States, are coordinating a multi-target attack. Based on their communication patterns and resource allocation, I believe the attack is planned for some time in the next 72 hours. Morrison stood up. With all due respect, Admiral Harrison, we're supposed to base national security decisions on computer analysis from someone who's never seen actual combat. How do we know she's not jumping at shadows? The room erupted in conversation. Some voices supported Morrison's position. Others urged patience. But Sarah could see the tide turning against her. The very thing she had feared was happening. Her lack of combat experience was overshadowing her evidence. Admiral Harrison banged his gavel. Order. Commander Chen, please present your findings. The board will evaluate the evidence and make their determination. Sarah clicked to her first slide, knowing she was fighting an uphill battle. But somewhere in America, 7 terrorists were putting the finishing touches on their plan. And she might be the only person who could stop them. The clock on the wall showed 800 exactly as Sarah began what could be either the most important briefing of her career or the end of it. Sarah clicked to her first slide, a map of the United States dotted with red markers. These 7 locations represent simultaneous financial transaction endpoints over the past 3 weeks. Each involves the same network of shell companies, but routed through different banks to avoid detection. Looks like normal business transactions to me, interrupted Colonel Davis, a gruff Special Forces veteran whose scarred hands rested on the table. How do you know this isn't just some legitimate international business? Sarah highlighted the transaction amounts, because the amounts follow a mathematical sequence. Each transfer is exactly 1.618 times larger than the previous one, the golden ratio. This isn't business. It's a coordination signal, Morrison scoffed. A math theory? That's your evidence of a terrorist attack? Maybe someone just likes pretty numbers. Laughter rippled through parts of the room. Sarah felt heat rising in her cheeks but pressed forward. The golden ratio has been used in terrorist communications before. The Madrid bombers in 2004. The London attackers in 2005. It's a signature. Commander Chen, General Williams interjected. You're asking us to believe that terrorists are using mathematical formulas to coordinate attacks. In my 30 years of military service, I've learned that the enemy is usually much simpler and more direct than analysts think. Sarah clicked to her next slide, showing intercepted communications. These are phone calls recorded over the past 6 weeks. The speakers use agricultural metaphors, planting seeds, watering gardens, and harvesting crops. Voice analysis confirms these are 7 different individuals. Agriculture is a common topic in many cultures, said Director Thompson from the CIA. People talk about farming all the time. This proves nothing. Not when the same speakers also discuss travel plans that correspond exactly with the financial transfers, Sarah shot back. She clicked to a timeline showing communication dates matched with money movements. Every time someone mentions seeds, there's a corresponding financial transaction within 48 hours. The room fell slightly quieter as officials studied the timeline. But Morrison wasn't finished. Let me get this straight, he said, standing up and walking closer to the screen. You want us to believe that 7 terrorists are coordinating the attack of the century using garden metaphors and math puzzles? This sounds like something out of a bad spy movie. Commander Morrison, Admiral Harrison warned. Let her finish. But Morrison was on a roll, feeding off the skepticism in the room. No, Admiral, this is exactly the problem with desk analysts. They see patterns in everything because they want to feel important. They turn random coincidences into international conspiracies. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she gripped the laser pointer. Everything she had worked for, every life she might save, was slipping away because of her lack of combat credentials. You want patterns? Morrison continued. I can show you patterns, too. The number of coffee cups in this room is 7. There are 7 windows on the east wall. Sarah Chen is speaking at 8 a.m. and 8-1 is 7. Therefore, coffee cups are planning to attack the Pentagon. The room erupted in laughter. Even some of the senior officers smiled. Sarah stood frozen at the front of the room, watching her credibility dissolve. But then her phone buzzed with an urgent message. As she read it, her face went pale. Admiral, she said, her voice cutting through the laughter. I just received confirmation from NSA intercepts. 20 minutes ago, all 7 subjects made phone calls using the same phrase, "The harvest begins at sunset." The laughter died immediately. Sarah clicked to a new slide showing real-time intercept data that had just been uploaded to her system. Furthermore, she continued, her voice gaining strength. 3 of the 7 have been confirmed boarding flights to Washington, D.C., New York, and Los Angeles within the past 4 hours. Morrison sat down abruptly. The room was now completely silent. Director Thompson leaned forward. Commander, are you saying these attacks could happen today? Sunset in Washington is at 6:47 p.m., Sarah replied. If my analysis is correct, we have less than 10 hours. General Williams studied the new data. What kind of attacks are we looking at? Sarah clicked to her analysis of the social media communications. Based on the coded messages, I believe they're planning coordinated bombings targeting critical infrastructure. The chemistry discussions suggest improvised explosive devices with enhanced destructive capability. Bridges? Asked Admiral Harrison. Possibly, but the urban planning discussions suggest targets with high symbolic value and maximum casualties. Sarah's voice was steady now, professional. The mockery had stopped. Federal buildings, transportation hubs, monuments. How certain are you about this assessment? Director Thompson asked. The pattern probability analysis shows 94.7% confidence for a coordinated attack. The timing correlation is 98.2%. Morrison, chastened but still skeptical, raised his hand. Even if you're right about the pattern, how do we know where they'll strike? You said 3 cities, but each of those has dozens of potential targets. Sarah clicked to her final analysis slide. The social media posts reference specific architectural features. Ionic columns reaching toward heaven. Foundations laid by founding fathers. Where democracy sleeps under marble dreams. The room was dead silent as officials processed the implications. The Capitol building, whispered General Williams. The Lincoln Memorial. Federal courthouses. And this is just Washington, Sarah continued. The New York and Los Angeles cells are using similar coded references to local landmarks. Admiral Harrison stood up. Director Thompson, what's the earliest we can get teams to these locations? We'd need to contact FBI field offices, coordinate with local law enforcement. Admiral, Morrison interrupted. We're about to mobilize massive resources based on pattern analysis. What if she's wrong? What if this is just coincidence and paranoia? Sarah turned to face Morrison directly. For weeks she had endured his mockery and dismissal, but now with lives hanging in the balance she found a strength she didn't know she possessed. Commander Morrison, you're right that I've never been in combat. I've never carried a wounded soldier or dodged enemy fire, but I've spent 3 years preventing American deaths in ways you can't imagine. She clicked back to a classified slide she wasn't supposed to show this group. The Pakistan network I exposed in 2022? That would have killed 37 Navy SEALs in Karachi. The Syrian bomb maker? His devices killed 18 Marines before I tracked him down. The German cells? They were planning to attack the Ramstein Air Base where your daughter is stationed. Morrison's face went white. The information about his daughter was classified, but Sarah had access to personnel files. I may not have combat experience, Sarah continued, but I have something else. I see patterns that others miss. I connect dots that others can't find. And right now those dots are pointing to the largest terrorist attack on American soil since 9/11. She turned back to face the room. You can dismiss me because I don't have the right ribbons on my chest. You can ignore my analysis because I've never been shot at. But if you do, people are going to die today. Americans are going to die because you couldn't accept that intelligence comes in different forms. The room remained silent for several long seconds. Finally, Admiral Harrison spoke. Director Thompson, initiate immediate threat response protocols for all 3 cities. I want bomb detection teams at every major federal building and monument. Admiral, Morrison said quietly. If we're wrong, we waste some resources and look foolish, Harrison replied. If she's right and we do nothing, we'll have blood on our hands. As officials began making urgent phone calls and issuing orders, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and terror. She had convinced them to act. But now came the hardest part, waiting to see if her analysis was correct. The clock on the wall showed 9:23 a.m. Sunset was in 9 hours and 24 minutes, and somewhere in America, 7 terrorists were putting their plan into motion. By 11:30 a.m., every major federal building in Washington, New York, and Los Angeles was crawling with bomb detection teams. FBI field offices had deployed their tactical units. Local police had established security perimeters around monuments and transportation hubs. The largest domestic security operation since 9/11 was underway, all based on the analysis of a woman with no combat badge. Sarah sat in the Pentagon's Crisis Management Center, watching multiple screens displaying live feeds from potential target locations. Admiral Harrison paced behind her, fielding calls from the Secretary of Defense, the FBI director, and the White House. Commander Morrison sat at a nearby console, his earlier arrogance replaced by tense anticipation. Any word from the field teams? Harrison asked. Nothing yet, sir, Sarah replied, her eyes scanning data streams from dozens of sources. But if my analysis is correct, they won't move until closer to sunset. Maximum symbolic impact. Director Thompson's voice crackled through the secure communication system from FBI headquarters. Admiral, we've got eyes on 2 of the 7 subjects, both in Washington. One near the Lincoln Memorial, another in the vicinity of the Capitol building. Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs. Her analysis was being validated in real time, but that meant people were about to die unless they acted perfectly. Are they carrying anything? Harrison asked. Both have large backpacks. We're maintaining surveillance distance to avoid spooking them. Morrison leaned over to Sarah. How do we know they won't just disappear if they suspect we're onto them? Because they've spent too much time and money getting to this point, Sarah replied, her fingers flying across her keyboard as she pulled up more data. This operation took months to coordinate. They won't abort unless they're absolutely certain they've been compromised. At 2:17 p.m., Sarah's computer chimed with an urgent alert. New intercepted communications showed rapid message exchanges between the 7 subjects. They're accelerating the timeline, Sarah announced, her voice tight with alarm. The sunset reference was misdirection. They're planning to strike during afternoon rush hour for maximum casualties. Harrison grabbed his secure phone. All teams, this is Admiral Harrison. Execute immediate interdiction. Repeat, move now. The crisis center erupted into controlled chaos. Radio chatter filled the air as tactical teams across 3 cities moved to arrest the suspects simultaneously. Sarah watched the live feeds, her analysis about to face its ultimate test. Team Alpha, Washington. We have eyes on Subject 1 at Lincoln Memorial. He's approaching the reflecting pool with a large backpack. Sarah's blood ran cold. The reflecting pool area would be packed with tourists and school groups on a Tuesday afternoon. Team Bravo, Capitol building. Subject 2 is entering the east entrance. Repeat, he's inside the building. Los Angeles team. We've lost visual on Subject 3. He was at Union Station but disappeared into the crowd. Morrison turned to Sarah. If you're wrong about this, his words were cut off by an explosion of radio traffic from New York. New York team. We have detonation! Repeat, we have detonation at Brooklyn Bridge approach. Sarah's screen showed live news feeds from New York. Smoke was billowing from the bridge's eastern approach where morning rush hour traffic was still heavy. Emergency vehicles were already screaming toward the scene. How many casualties? Harrison demanded. Unknown at this time. Bridge structure appears intact, but multiple vehicles involved. Sarah's hands shook as she pulled up her analysis files. That wasn't one of my predicted targets. Brooklyn Bridge wasn't in their communication patterns. So you were wrong, Morrison said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. No, Sarah said, her voice growing stronger as she studied the data. They changed the plan. Look, she highlighted new intercepts from the past hour. They detected our surveillance and split their operation. New York was supposed to be Grand Central Station. They moved to Brooklyn Bridge as a diversion. Team Alpha. Harrison barked into his radio. Status on Lincoln Memorial! Subject 1 appears to be assembling some kind of device. We need immediate evacuation of the area. Sarah watched the Lincoln Memorial feed as uniformed officers began moving tourists away from the reflecting pool. But there were hundreds of people in the area. School buses lined Constitution Avenue. A Japanese tour group was posing for photos on the memorial steps. They'll never evacuate everyone in time, Sarah whispered. Team Bravo, Capitol Building. Subject 2 has entered the rotunda. Repeat, he's in the rotunda with multiple civilian tourists present. Harrison's face was grim. Do we have clear shots on either target? Negative on both. Too many civilians. Sarah stared at her screens, her mind racing through possibilities. The terrorists had chosen their positions perfectly. Surrounded by innocent people, making tactical intervention nearly impossible. But then she noticed something in the communication intercepts. A pattern within the pattern. Admiral, she said urgently, I need to speak to the team leaders directly. Chen, this isn't the time. Please, sir. I think I know how to stop this. Harrison handed her the radio microphone. Sarah's voice carried across 3 cities to the tactical teams preparing to risk their lives. All teams, this is Lieutenant Commander Chen. I've been tracking these subjects' behavioral patterns for weeks. Subject 1 at Lincoln Memorial is left-handed. He'll instinctively move toward his left if surprised. Team Alpha, approach from his right side. Copy that. How do you know he's left-handed? Social media analysis. He posted photos of himself writing, eating, throwing a baseball. Always left-handed. Team Bravo, Subject 2 in the Capitol has a pronounced limp in his right leg from an old injury. He can't run effectively. If you spook him, he'll try to find cover rather than flee. How could you possibly know that? Morrison asked. Medical records from his visa application. He broke his leg in a motorcycle accident 2 years ago. Sarah continued coordinating with the teams, providing detailed behavioral analysis for each suspect. She knew which one would panic under pressure, which would try to negotiate, which would attempt to detonate early if cornered. Team Alpha engaging now. The Lincoln Memorial feed showed tactical officers moving in coordinated formation. They approached the suspect exactly as Sarah had predicted, from his right side, forcing him to turn into their line of fire. Suspect 1 down. Device secured. Cheers erupted in the crisis center, but Sarah remained focused on her screens. Team Bravo, Subject 2 is moving toward the Senate chamber. He's looking for a place to hide, just as I predicted. We see him. Moving to intercept. Minutes later. Subject 2 down. Package secured. Los Angeles team, we've reacquired Subject 3. He's at LAX Terminal 4. Sarah pulled up LAX's layout on her screen. Team Charlie, he'll head for the international terminal. That's where the crowds are thickest, and it matches their pattern of targeting symbolic American locations that foreigners frequent. Copy. Moving to Terminal 4. One by one, the reports came in. All 7 subjects apprehended. All devices secured. The coordinated attack that would have killed hundreds, possibly thousands, had been stopped. But it was only then that the full magnitude of what had happened began to sink in. Director Thompson's voice came through the speakers. Preliminary analysis of the devices shows sophisticated explosive capability. Each bomb was designed to bring down major structural elements. Lincoln Memorial, Capitol Rotunda, LAX Terminal 4. We're talking about casualties in the thousands. The crisis center fell silent. Sarah stared at her screens, feeling the weight of lives saved, disasters averted. Morrison walked over to her workstation. His face was pale, his earlier arrogance completely gone. Chen, he said quietly, I owe you an apology. Hell, every American owes you their life. Commander Morrison, no, let me finish. Morrison's voice carried through the room, drawing everyone's attention. I've been wrong about you, about what it means to serve your country. You saved more lives today than I've saved in 3 combat deployments. Sarah felt tears threatening to spill from her eyes. The validation she had never thought would come was finally here. Admiral Harrison approached her workstation. Commander Chen, I just received a call from the Secretary of Defense. Tomorrow morning, you're briefing the Joint Chiefs of Staff on intelligence reformation. They want to hear your recommendations for integrating analytical specialists into operational planning. Sir, they've realized something today. Combat experience isn't the only form of service that matters. Sometimes the most important battles are fought with computers and code, not guns and grenades. 3 months later, Sarah stood once again in the Pentagon corridor, looking at the wall of photographs. But now among the combat veterans and decorated warriors hung a new photo. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, recipient of the Defense Intelligence Medal for preventing the largest terrorist attack in American history. She wore no combat action badge. No Purple Heart adorned her chest. But in her eyes was something even more valuable, the quiet confidence of someone who had proven that heroism comes in many forms. As she walked down the corridor, junior officers nodded respectfully. Some stopped to ask questions about intelligence analysis. Others requested advice on pattern recognition techniques. Sarah had finally found her place in the warrior culture, not despite her lack of combat experience, but because of the unique skills that experience had allowed her to develop. The girl with no combat badge had briefed the Joint Chiefs, and in doing so, she had changed the way America thought about warfare in the digital age. Sometimes the most important battles are won not on foreign soil, but in the quiet spaces where brilliant minds connect dots that others cannot see. And sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones nobody expects.